We can pause it.
The real purpose of this event is to turn knowledge into action and to focus on hope. So hopefully you walk away feeling a little bit more empowered, a little bit more informed, and a little bit more hopeful about what's going on in our community today. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the Community College for hosting us, the Housing to Protect Cape Cod Coalition, and all of the folks who make that work possible, the Chamber, our local advocates, and of course HAC for being a wonderful collaborator on this work. And ground rules for Q&A at the end of this session. We'll have an open Q&A. We'll submit them through VVox just so we can make sure that we've collected that data and we have those questions on record. So scan the code. If you have problems, I'll raise your hand. Happy to come over and show you how to do it. And Christina is going to Vanna White us later. You can wave. She'll be our Q&A Vanna White for sure. And it is my great pleasure now to turn things over to our moderator, Rob Brennan. Rob joined the Housing Assistance in September 2024 and brings more than 25 years of experience in real estate as a developer and as a housing advocate. And in addition to his leadership roles at HAC, he's chaired the Government Affairs Committee for the Home Builders and Remodelers Association of Massachusetts and has served on both the Advisory Council and the Board of Directors for the National Home Builder Association of Home Builders. Rob, I'll turn it to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. And thank you and CCYP for conceiving of this project and tonight's session. I want to thank you for all the work that you've put in on this. As Emily mentioned, my name is Rob Brennan. I serve as the Chief Legal Officer for Housing Assistance Corporation, and I'm a housing advocate. I believe that there is a way to do better, to meet the unmet housing needs here on Cape Cod. So I want to get that right out front and center. So just a few quick opening remarks. This is being recorded and is going to be used by Cape Cod Young Professionals, including their student chapter. So I know we have a lot more people that signed up that were interested than were able to attend here tonight. So we're going to be recording and we're going to be going over some fundamentals. Raise hands if you are a zoning expert in this room. All right. Seeing none and anticipating that our students who are interested in watching are also interested in understanding, what is the interplay between housing, which is a need that we all have, which is either met or unmet or met to a degree that we wish was met more. And we have zoning kind of looming out as this, in large sense, amorphous thing for a lot of people that don't understand kind of the interplay between zoning and developing and housing. So I'm going to lay a little bit of groundwork for you. So zoning came about in the early 1900s. New York City was the first city to adopt zoning in 1916. And the purpose of zoning at that point was to separate uses, right? Smokestacks over here, houses over here, right? Separating incompatible uses. The Supreme Court took up the issue of zoning, right? It seems like all kinds of issues rise to the Supreme Court. And the same thing was true back in 1926, when the Supreme Court took up the question of the village of Euclid, Ohio versus Ambler Realty Company. And that was a question, is zoning, and particularly zoning that was adopted in Euclid, Ohio, constitutional? Is it within the police powers of the state? And if so, delegated down to the delegated police powers of the municipality? The answer is yes, that zoning was a valid exercise. So we have Supreme Court endorsing the concept of zoning in 1926. Key principles of early zoning, Euclidean zoning as it was called, and then as it evolved, into World War II, remained, separating incompatible uses. Uses that were noisy from uses where people were putting their heads down, at night. The emphasis, was on orderly urban development, right? So we go to war, World War II, we come back, and again, we're using zoning, but we're also doing something else post-World War II. We're creating housing, right? We're creating starter homes for GIs who are returning from World War II, starting their families, and had the benefit of the GI Bill, benefit now of government-backed home financing, and we did that very well. If you look at examples post-World War II, community after community, state after state, developed these tract housing where we were building more efficiently. It went from kind of being an artisan, people building homes one at a time, to production, right? Doing things, standardizing trusses and standardizing walls. And we were able to build starter homes and starter communities very well. And folks then populated those and started their families. And you might have had at the time, a 1,000 square foot, home, sitting on a 5,000, square foot lot. And that formed a community. Then folks kind of looked around and said, we like this, right? We all agree this is kind of a nice community. We want to keep it that way, but we're worried. We're worried that it might change. So let's raise the entry point. Let's raise the hurdle so that anyone who coming in, instead of having a 1/4 acre lot or a 5,000 square foot lot, let's go to a 1/2 acre. So we know that anyone coming in, those families will be of means and will be minded of wanting a 1/2 acre lot and being able to afford a 1/2 acre lot. So that's when you started zoning changes, right? Zoning amendments were intended, to raise the bar. And in the interest, instead of preserving character, let's raise the entry bar. And that continued 60s, 70s, were really the big changes of upzoning, right? Or is it down zoning? But increasing the amount of land that was needed. And at that time also, changes in zoning said, well, we like that we all have these, single families, except for that guy over there who did a 2-family because we weren't prohibiting it. But, let's not have any more of those, right? So prohibiting 2 families, prohibiting 3 families, and being more prescriptive over the kind of zoning or the kind of homes that could be built, how much land would have to go with those, and then accordingly, what the cost of those, homes would be. So that was the big shift in zoning, in the 60s and in the 70s. And 2 great resources, if you want to learn more about that. A colleague that I worked on another project with, Amy Dane, did a wonderful study, within the past year or so. And there's a YouTube video. It's called Exclusionary by Design. And Amy really digs into what happened, in Massachusetts during the 60s and 70s and how zoning changed from separating noxious uses from residential to really being about preserving property value and excluding folks and families that weren't of a certain means when those hurdles in those communities weren't there originally. So that's one. And the other one with a similar title is a book called Excluded. And that was written by Richard Kallenberg. And Housing Assistance had Richard as a guest speaker in Woods Hole. And he looked at some of what was going on, on the Cape and in our communities. That video is also available. I encourage you to pick up the book, watch that video, and listen to some of what Richard had to say, his take on the Cape situation. So zoning now becoming a tool, invoking terms like preserving neighborhood character, invoking terms like preserving natural resources, but really, having the net result of restricting supply and driving up home values. Impacts, we see the manifestation, large minimum lot sizes. Until recently in communities, bans on accessory dwelling units or restrictions on the ability to by right build accessory dwelling units, lengthy permitting process says, and discretionary reviews. These are all things that, again, didn't exist, in World War II when we were building out the Levitt towns and trying to accommodate the needs of returning GIs. So discretionary reviews, digging into, the materials that are being built and the aesthetics and increasing standards and layering on top, in downtown areas, historic requirements pegged to, an arbitrary point in time, but historic requirements. Kallenberg book, the Dane video will show, and they demonstrate disproportionate impact of zoning on low-income families and people of color. And that's just a fact. Again, look at Kallenberg, watch Dane's video. So here in the Cape, what's been the manifestation, in our housing market, this interplay again between zoning, development, and housing affordability? Well, I can tell you, again, more facts. Median price of a single-family home on Cape Cod has risen 62% since 2019, and that's gone from 449,000 in 2019 to 730,000 2023. As of 2024, it was up over 800,000. Median household income, however, on Cape is 95,000, right? What that means is you need to be making twice the median household income on Cape Cod to purchase a home. So that chasm between housing affordability and family income on the Cape is incredibly pronounced. Top challenges that we have in our market: high housing costs that are created by strict zoning, also the competition that exists here, right? So we have working Cape Codders. We have the folks that are the backbone of our community that we count on to teach in our schools, work in our hospitals, teach tennis, work on boats, do all the things to support our tourist economy, as well as supporting just our community. They are bearing the burden of this, again, disproportionately, and they're also competing for homes when they come available with folks that are buying their second home, maybe sometimes buying their third home, right? So going back to $95,000 median household income on Cape Cod, piece of property comes up in, Harwich, and you have families that their median income or their household income is multiple times of that. I say it's like bringing a knife to a gunfight, and I grew up in Somerville, so forgive that reference, but it's an unfair market. It's the same market though that exists in ski resorts, right? So you have ski resorts, you have locals, you have folks that are running and the backbone of those communities, and they're again competing in those ski resort communities for housing with folks that are buying it as their second or third home and are able to pay multiple millions. We also here on the Cape have limited developable land, 3%. Pair that with a fragile ecosystem. So focusing new housing development on places where the infrastructure, already exists. That means oftentimes redeveloping and looking to maximize already developed uses and properties, particularly in our village centers. We also deal with local opposition, right? So we have local opposition here. Not going to surprise anyone. Not in my backyard. I'm not opposed to housing, but just not here, right? Every community, every neighborhood that says that, not opposed to housing, just not here, you're driving that housing, entirely off Cape. We've seen that repeated, again and again. And, there's examples of opportunities that will be coming up, in the coming months and years. You'll see, and already we've seen, folks marshaling, against that and saying, this vacant 14 acres really is best for public restrooms or dog parks, but not housing. So local opposition here is real. Characteristics of the Cape Cod zoning: single-family homes on large lots, lengthy review process, and again, the political pressure to preserve rural or historic character. Adverse consequences: severe shortage of affordable homes and rentals, workforce displacement. Again, that whole tension, or the invocation, I should say, to create a tension of preserving the history versus planning for history. So futures on Cape Cod, including futures of Cape Cod young professionals, futures of the students that are here, are oftentimes held hostage to the memories of folks that are looking to freeze it in time, right? And preserve neighborhoods at a point in time that they have nostalgia for. And that means, diminishing opportunities for creating housing. One example, and this is a recent example, in Barnstable. Barnstable passed form-based code that allowed fourth floor development. Barnstable also has, a historic district with that wrote criteria that are at odds with the intention of a form-based code, which again means allowing as of right as long as it fits within certain criteria. So this was an example of a proposed project at the intersection of Main and Ocean. It was going to bring 22 apartments along with first floor restaurant on on the stories as you can see there and the height. That was shot down, even though it's allowed as a right under zoning, shot down by the Historic Commission, again, in the name of, preserving history and preserving, character. And this is what it looks like now, right? So that's what's left on Main Street. And that's another, perspective. So just an example of, again, where these, where zoning and other regulations are at odds, with developing housing. So, so kind of setting the table, with that, I want to turn it over, to our incredible group of panelists, and we'll engage them with a discussion. The idea behind today's event was to get folks that serve and are engaged in what we're calling grass tops, right? Kind of positions and on boards, and that are engaged in kind of decision making, here on the Cape, but also grassroots, right? Grassroots being, folks that are engaged locally or just kind of coming into, being a housing advocate, right? And how do you get involved? So we're going to be hearing from folks at all levels. So our panel today includes Paul Niedzwiecki, who hopefully most of you may know, or some of you may know. Paul is currently the CEO of the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce, former executive director of the Cape Cod Commission. John Carey is a developer, 36 years old. He's a one-man show. And, we talk about the subtitle for this being, reasons for hope, right? Housing 101 and reasons for hope. And John is certainly one of those, reasons for hope. Young professional, engaged on Cape Cod, working to solve the housing challenges. John is known for his creative approach to development that really centers around engaging and working with the communities to see what their unmet needs are and working with them to go down the road. So you'll be hearing from John. Mara Glatzel is a coach, author, and vice chair of Truro's Housing Authority, member of Truro's Zoning Task Force, and president of Truro's Central Schools Family Group, and board member for Earth Star Play School nonprofit. So a lot of perspectives represented by Mara. And Seth Etienne is a new employee with Community Development Partners. He's working with their community outreach group, graduate of Barnstable High School and Virginia Tech with a degree in architecture. He's studying data science and a former member of the now sunset ad hoc zoning and regulatory agreement committee for the town of Barnstable. So, so let's turn it over to let's get going with the panel. So I guess, starting, one question that I'd ask all the panelists to address in just a few words, how would you explain your view on the current housing situation on Cape Cod, and how did that view come to be? What's your perspective on it? So, Mara, we'll start with you.
So focused on the microphone that I forgot the question.
No. So your perspective of housing on Cape Cod, your view, what's your take on it, and how was your take informed, right? So what are you drawing on to kind of reach your conclusion?
Well, I grew up in Provincetown, so a lot of my interest and desire to participate in housing advocacy on all fronts on the Outer Cape comes from wanting to be in community the way I was as I grew up, and to share that with my children, and to make sure that there is housing preserved for people who I see, people who I love, people who I've known my whole life, who just get pushed further and further and further out. So I think it's a very a hyper local and personal experience.
Paul, I know you've got
Yeah, I would say on the Cape, what we're dealing with, we have 500 miles of coastline, a third of the Massachusetts coastline down here. So coastal property is a higher valued property. So our property values are higher than the state average. We have a seasonal economy, so our wages are lower than state average. So there's always been an affordability issue. Layer on top of that, that 37% of the housing stock on the Cape are second homes. Layer on top of that, that 86% of the land on the Cape is either developed or protected. And of all the single-family homes we have, 82% of them are single-family homes compared to a 52% average statewide. So when you put that together, you realize why there's such a crunch, why there's an incredible demand, but housing affordability has always been an issue. The pandemic really just exacerbated that, exponentially for a lot of different reasons. But that's the challenge that we have on the Cape moving forward. So that's how I see it. That's what's important.
Yeah. Thank you.
So my perspective on the housing situation is it's grim. I'm 36 years old. I bought a house 4 years ago. I could never buy one today. We do most of our projects in Harwich. I could never buy a house in Harwich. It'd make no sense. It's 800 grand, 7% interest. You'd never do it. But I'm hopeful. It's optimistic. We are finally getting support. We are proposing projects that are good projects that fit in with communities and what they need. And we are finally getting the momentum to get these projects approved. I still go to meetings every week. We have a select board meeting next weekend, and it will be 99% 60 plus. It'll be me and maybe the guy operating the computer who's under 40. So when you try to get stuff approved, it's difficult, but we do have momentum, and we're starting to build meaningful projects. We're delivering 10 projects, 10 apartments to Harwich next month, and another developer is doing 26. So that's 40 in 1 year. So at this pace, we're going to make real change eventually.
Could you please repeat the question?
So, yeah. Your view on the housing situation on Cape Cod, and describe your perspective. You're looking at it as X, or you've come to understand it as Y.
Like in one word, it would just be bleak. It's like hopeful, but despite what I've seen and read and learned and understood, like almost in spite that we can make things better. And I say that from the perspective of someone who grew up in Hyannis, went away to Virginia Tech to study architecture, learned about planning for a year in Ecuador, came back to the community where I grew up, and now has started my master's in data science. So unfortunately, I'm learning how to read numbers, economic numbers in a time like this. And exactly what Mr. Nedzuki said earlier about the different kinds of layers of data you need to look into. I would also ask about when did those particular variables happen? Did one follow the other, or is one causal of the other? It's, I wouldn't say unfortunate, but on one hand, it's almost overwhelming with different variables that we're up against. But my experiences being on zoning with Councilwoman Turkelston and lovely familiar face, Eric Schwab, it was a very interesting way of seeing the different stakeholders involved and parties involved and what each entity wants and how we could work towards a singular future if such exists. If not, it's figuring out, okay, what is the best pathway forward while avoiding what could be catastrophic if we do nothing.
Right. So Seth, having just recently served on the ad hoc zoning and regulatory committee, I mean, how would you describe kind of the folks that you were working with, the folks that were becoming before you? What was the balance of the split between those secure and owning housing and those in need of and seeking the opportunities to get into home ownership or seeking to create more rental opportunities? Who are the voices that were?
Ooh, the voices? If anything, I would say I would come close to being the advocate for people who are seeking entry into the housing market, or just at the bare minimum, lowering the cost of housing. Structurally, just by the way that things are designed, the majority of people, not just on town council, but on the committee that I was on, are either on town council itself or they already own their homes.
Yeah.
So it's less about, I mean, it would be very easy, very simple just to go on Google, go on Twitter, get some memes, dunk on people with facts and just fact bomb people. But it's less about winning an argument and truly understanding and learning from other people what are we all talking about? What is the true issue at hand? We know that there's a housing crisis on Cape. However, with zoning, at least on the committee that I was on, we only focused in on Hyannis, as if the problem is going to be solved and fixed by only focusing on one part of town.
Right. And obviously not the case. I mean, lots of parts to Barnstable and lots of towns on Cape Cod. I mean, you know, Hyannis being one village within one town among 15 towns.
Yes, exactly. And also thinking about, okay, who is at these meetings? Who are the public comments that I'm reading that I see on email or that are being read out loud during the meetings at the beginning? And also who's not in the room being represented? Are they at work after the meeting? Are they the folks that are at the restaurant serving me after the meeting? And that they're not at the meeting itself where they could advocate whether or not these few changes to zoning are going to increase my rent. It's being at a zoning committee meeting, listening to arguments for why we should increase the parking minimum, which would therefore, it's a long chain of events, but at the end of such change, more than likely the rent on that property is going to go up. And it's explaining that to the server and hearing the server tell me in response that I don't see how this is possible. I've already seen more of my friends move into their cars because they can't afford the rent in their property.
Right. So it sounds like your experience and your observation of the conversations and the debate at public meetings is that representation among and by, you know, Cape Cod young professionals is very low compared, you know, proportionately to the folks that own houses and you know have, I guess, property values to, you know, to worry about protecting.
You could say that. I don't want to prescribe to that because I feel like that's too easy to paint a brush of all the NIMBYs that I'm going up against. They just want to protect their own property values, and like that is a question to investigate on like a separate branch. But it's also a case of the people that are making the decisions in terms of where we can live, where we can build housing, where we can make things affordable, where we can make a more sustainable Barnstable going forward. I'm not sure. I have little confidence that they're in connection with the people that need that the most.
Got it. Great. Thank you. Paul, let's pivot to kind of the impacts of the, you know, the housing crisis on the Cape to, you know, to our local economy. So, you know, how does the lack of, you know, attainable housing, you know, impact business success in our region?
The most direct impact is the workforce, labor supply. Currently, 27% of the labor supply on the Cape are crossing the bridges every day.
Mm-hmm.
So almost a third of the workforce doesn't live here. They live someplace else. And that makes it harder to recruit employees, harder to staff up, harder to grow your business. So from the Chamber's perspective, it's about labor supply. It's the biggest challenge that most employers face right now is housing at all levels. At all levels, it's difficult. Even if you're Cape Cod Healthcare and you're recruiting nurses or doctors, difficult for them to find housing. And those are very portable skill sets and degrees, so they can go to other places where it's easier to buy a house and live. And we're seeing people make those kind of choices. So it's really the impact that we see on housing is primarily through labor supply. The larger threat, though, is really to the middle class on the Cape. You know, Rob mentioned you can make up to $80,000 as a family on the Cape to still qualify for subsidized housing if you can find it. You have to make 210 to even think about getting into the market. And I don't know about you, but families that make between 80 and 210,000, that's everyone I know. You know, and so they don't have options right now. And so that missing middle has to be filled in. And, you know, this is a market rate problem. So we can't subsidize our way out of it completely. We got to be creative about how we approach this. But But policies like deed restricting existing houses for year-round residents, something that the chamber really supports. We think that could be a really helpful way to address that sort of missing middle piece without having to go through the pains of housing construction. But we need appropriate density in areas as well. I mean, it's this monoculture of single-family homes that really long-term presents a threat. And there are other threats that we're looking at the chamber that I don't think a lot of people are thinking about right now. And some of that is related to climate change. And whether you believe in climate change or not, or what's driving it, the insurance companies believe in it. You know, if you look at what's happened in Southern California with the fires, and then you bring it back here. There was just a report released in December of last year. And in 2023 on Martha's Vineyard, more than 1 out of every 10 homeowners that had homeowners insurance lost it. And I mentioned the Vineyard because that's in the category of counties with 10,000 or fewer homeowner insurance policies. When you go to counties with more than 10,000, Barnstable County ranks 3rd in the nation at risk of losing homeowners insurance due to the threats from increase in severe and significant weather events, behind 2 fire-ravaged counties in California. And so that stuff is happening now. So we're seeing on the Vineyard school teachers that are selling their homes because they can't afford to self-insure. And they're selling it to people with disposable incomes. So when that Category 5 hurricane does hit, the people with a disposable income is going to rebuild if it's their 3rd home, or are we becoming a disposable destination and a disposable community? And, you know, we're chasing out and we're having this slow attrition of the middle class and the people that made the Cape what it is today and made it the destination that so many people like to come and visit. We're losing them. So short term for the chamber, it's about labor supply. Long term, it's about the middle class.
Thank Paul, any other initiatives that the chamber is working on? Because what you just mentioned, I think, goes to, you know, our subtitle here, Reasons to Have Hope. But I know, you know, that you folks are incredibly engaged here. So is there just anything else that you want to let folks know about?
Well, you know, I think we played a part along with HAC and a lot of the other affordable housing advocates on the Cape of trying to influence the Governor's Affordable Homes Act that came out. And there are some really Cape-specific programs and advantages in there, I think because of our participation. But we would really like to see these deed restriction programs put in place, a centralized source of revenue that can buy these deed restrictions. Vail, Colorado does it with their Indeed program. So they'll pay $75,000 to any homeowner that wants to deed restrict their home for year-round residents. And it's had the unintended consequence of being a first-time homebuyers program, because you can go to the closing, you can agree to restrict your deed, and you get $75,000 in addition for your down payment. So that's one program that we really feel strongly about. There are other programs, like there's a component in the governor's recently passed Affordable Homes Act that for the first time creates a seasonal designation for communities. You know, and when you have communities that have such a large percentage of their homes are second homes, these housing challenges that hit everybody in the state and hit everybody and hit people nationally, they just land very differently in seasonal communities. So the recognition of the challenge of seasonal communities when it comes to housing is an important way to step forward. Continuing to sort of negotiate how to deal with that. We're on the seasonal communities committee designation. We had 2 workshops today on that. And so we're hopeful that we can find a way there. But in communities like Truro, Chatham, 70% of the housing stock are second homeowners. So, you know, this is that's, I think, how we're not going to build our way out of this problem, because 86% of the property, the land on the Cape is either developed or protected. But we need to build, and we need to build the right kind of housing, a different kind of housing that by design comes into the market in a less expensive way. And then we need to maximize the existing homes that we have in a way that we can preserve those homes, like I said before, for the people that make Cape Cod what it is today.
Thank you. John, you're on the front lines. You're you've rolled up your sleeves and you're doing this. I mean, describe, what is a day in the life, for you? What do you go through? What is the process, to develop housing? What's been the road you've been on?
I guess our road started 3 years ago. I was basically building second homes for wealthy people, and there was no reward in that. It wasn't enjoyable. So we focused on the housing situation. We had an opportunity in Harwich, and this is 3 years ago. And we had to submit a bid through an RFP. We were selected, and we were able to buy a piece of land, luckily at a lower rate because it was RFP and it was complicated. But we had to buy it before we even knew what we could build. So there's already risk there. Most people wouldn't take that bet. So from there, we spent about 6 months hiring engineers, spent about 40 grand designing the parking and the buildings. And then we had to go to planning board. And that was 2 or 3 months. And before that, we had to do historic because it's an old building. We had to do zoning board of appeals. We had to go to the water commission, and we had to go to the select board for a stormwater permit, all before we had any permission to build anything. And so we got through all those, and we got our approval to build 10 units of year-round housing. It took about 8 months to find financing. None of the local banks, even though they say they're going to finance these things, they wouldn't touch it because it was speculative. Any new construction project, speculative, it's kind of BS. So we were able to go to a private lender who financed the project for us. So 2 years in, we break ground, and we're going to be done next month. And 2.5 years in, the water commission came back and said, we're not going to pay to extend your water mains. You're not going to have water for this project. And they said, how'd you not know this, John, before you bought this? Well, I'm not a company. I don't have a team. I don't have attorneys, even though I'd like to have Rob someday. But you can't check all the boxes if you ever want these projects to get off the ground. So you got to hit the ground and just go. And we got the approval. They extended the water main. But there's probably 22 steps to complete a multifamily development on Cape Cod. Any one of those 22 can sink you. And there's no way to check all the boxes or get the approvals before. So it really is kind of a, start digging and hopefully you get through the other side of the tunnel at some point. So it's grim. And so right now we're building 1 unit of housing at $250,000 per unit. That's a 1-bed apartment. I spent 3 years designing the cheapest, most effective, and appropriate 1-bedroom you can possibly build. It's beautiful. It has wood floors. They're reclaimed. It's got nice appliances. It's something I would live in. And that's $250,000. And so I had to borrow $2.5 million to build 10 of these things. And for 3 years, we haven't received 1 penny. And in 2 months, we'll finally receive $400 per month per unit. So that's $4,000 basically per month. It's $48,000 a year. Nobody would ever make this investment. It's a 2% return on year 4. The S&P is 8% every year. That'd be a 36% return. So it's a terrible crapshoot, but it's important and it's meaningful. And luckily, that $48,000 will come every year. So there is incentive, but it requires so many different things to work out first. You need cheap land. Towns should be finding pieces of land, earmarking them for year-round housing, and getting them out to people like us to build this. You need terrible support from the communities. One neighbor, as Rob mentioned, can sink you. I had one lady that lives in North Carolina sue the project because she didn't want a project next to hers. She doesn't live here. She's here 1 month a year, and she can hire a lawyer from Truro to sue me. And it just made no sense. And because of the support of Harwich and the select board and all those people, we got unanimous support across maybe 15 different hearings. But other than that, I was
going to say, John, they can try to sink you, but they're not going to sink you.
Well, but somebody like me that doesn't have a company or a bankroll behind you, if they delay me 6 months, that's a lot of interest. So they could sink us. And that's why you want to partner with these small developers that care and are local and participate in the community. Because if you get these national builders, they're going to come in and they're going to put 100 units and it's going to be hideous. And so it's like, it makes sense to try to partner with the local people, but you got to support them because we can't do it ourselves.
John, why are you doing this? I mean, again, you could be, I'm sure, in plenty of industries making lots more. And I think the perception that, developers are just kind of printing money, obviously you've debunked that. So why are you doing this?
Yeah, we're 3 years in, we haven't made 1 penny. It's important. It's a challenge, worth hanging your hat on. And it's meaningful change for a community and it's rewarding. Like I said, building the single family houses are not rewarding. These people don't use the houses. You're doing something that's changing a community. And Paul, I know you know your stuff, but I disagree. I think we can build our way out of this. And I think it's the only way to do it. And I think if you add enough attractive, well-built units to a community, you're going to lower demand on the rest of the housing stock, because you can't build single-family homes anymore. There's not enough land. As you said, 87% is taken up. So we have commercial highways in almost every town, including Truro, and I think those need to be earmarked for appropriately sized, attractive multifamily apartments.
Yeah. And Paul, you're nodding. I assume you agree that building is part of, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me just ask, you know, we'll go down the route. Well, first of all, let me turn to Mara. Mara, one of the things, you know, you're, as someone who grew up here, you know, on the Cape, someone who is now engaged, not just, you know, on the housing front, but on multiple, and understanding that, you know, an audience here on why we're recording, you know, is for the Cape Cod young professionals, including their, you know, their chapter here at the college. So what are things that, you know, that young professionals, that young people growing up here on the Cape can do? How do they activate and get involved? What would your recommendations be?
It's a great question. As we have mentioned, things in Truro are pretty bleak. 67% of our homes are seasonal. 56% of our population is over 65. Many of our homes are second, third, fourth, fifth homes for people. And the school has shrunk from 200 students to, I think, 74 students go to my kids' school right now. So the impact on our community is immense. And there are so many reasons to lose hope and to just stop going to meetings. All of our meetings are packed with people who are retired, who can afford to spend time, especially during the middle of the day, to go to these lengthy meetings and deliver public comment on end and on end. And something that we've seen in Truro that's really successful, and I feel so fortunate to be a part of it, is an increase in people who I grew up with, people who are good friends of mine, who have families, who want to raise their kids together, who are becoming involved. And I think we have a very sort of wide net because we're approaching things from so many different perspectives. Because you can't just be involved in the housing conversation without, you know, I mentioned here that I'm the president of the school PTA. That's actually a really important job for a housing advocate, because nobody who has kids in the school in Truro goes to a town meeting pretty much ever in their life. And getting those people who I know and love and grew up with, many of them, to come to town meeting, to participate, to deliver public comment, to show up and take part in a conversation that is vitally important for the sustainability of their community and for their future and for their housing, it takes a lot of handholding and a lot of one-to-one approach and a lot of like me showing my face. And it's tricky too, because, you know, I've had people say to me in a public meeting, why are we trying to keep young families in Truro? Truro has no need for children.
Wow.
No need for children, right? Like, what is a need for a child? And that's the vibe that we are dealing with in Truro. And so I think that, you know, part of that is like having public meetings in the school, bringing people who never go into any of these spaces that have local families in them, so that we are creating these more kind of like interwoven tapestries of community so that we can be in relationship with each other. Because otherwise, by and large, it's people who come 1-2 weeks a year and don't care. But they might care if they don't have coffee anymore. I mean, we don't really have coffee anymore, so I don't know if they're caring yet. But we are losing so many businesses locally.
Mhm.
And so I think a lot of my focus is on how do we, it's a long game, and I am relentlessly hopeful. That's just a part of how I operate. But taking a really long game approach I was recently the chair of the local comprehensive plan. That took us 7 years to complete. Part of that and several other projects that I've done, I've focused on creating many opportunities for public outreach and for community forums. Most of those are me standing there with people yelling at me about all of the reasons why everything that I stand for is wrong. But that's important to do, actually. Being able to have conversations, being able to eke out even a little bit like, okay, so you care about your rural character of this town. What I hear is you want scattered site housing, not no housing, scattered site housing, right? So, having these sorts of conversations where you're going to be willing to take it, where you're not afraid to engage in conversations, where you do listen to and hear the concerns and kind of say, all right, well, this isn't a conversation about building no housing. That's not on the table. But maybe the conversation is, how does this look? How does this incorporate itself into our community feel? How do we bring people to the table so they feel heard, so they feel included in the process? I'm currently on the zoning task force, and we're working on bringing a article to town meeting in 2 weeks for a zoning overlay district for a big property that we are hoping to develop of up to 160 units, which is huge for Truro. We've agreed to a phased approach. We passed the plan, the original plan for the 160 units at town meeting. And so what we're bringing back is this zoning overlay district. And again, it's like giving people a voice. They didn't want an RFP. All right. So, can we create some sort of zoning with a lot of community input that passes through at town meeting that brings this project forward? And even though never going to please everybody, can we please some people? Can we let people at least feel like they've been heard, had opportunities to contribute? And can we work together? Because at the end of the day, we have to live together. And I take that seriously.
No, thank you. Paul, one of the questions or one of the justifications, that we often hear where we see, an argument that sounds like, NIMBY, is, well, this is about preserving, my home values. And, can you debunk that in the context of how, creating workforce housing, does that devalue, existing homes, or does the creation of workforce housing and, the supply of labor and allowing restaurants to stay open, is that on balance, a net benefit to, existing homeowners?
Yeah, well, change is hard, right? Nobody likes change except a baby with a wet diaper. So, it's hard and it can be scary. And when you have developments that come in, especially there's a lot of density, you're going to get pushback from, residential neighbors that abut the project. The problem is everybody in town doesn't have a stake in that decision. So you can have a handful of people that can show up at select board meetings and influence select boards and town councils. But it's really a tyranny of the minority in some respect. So I think it would be better if we could get all towns engaged, in these sort of siting and development. I think towns should do more proactive zoning. I mean, zoning is about what you can't do. It's hard to grow a community or to evolve as a community if you're playing by rules that are negative about what you can't do. But where we've seen, housing start to develop, places like even Mashpee Commons, as they're sort of adding housing there, you see a sense of community that builds up about it. And monocultures are always at risk. And that's one of the risks that we face on the Cape. We don't have the diversity in housing typology that really healthy communities can have. You can hang on to something. You can hang on, try to freeze something for 10, 20 years.
Mhm.
But eventually, that opposition is going to go away. But what kind of community are you going to have at that point?
Right.
Where are you going to be? You're going to be ahead, you're going to be behind, and what kind of these exogenous forces that are going to happen things are going to happen that we can't think of, that we don't even see coming around the corner right now. Monocultures are always at threat for that. And I still go back to this sort of coastal property issue. Like a lot of people don't even know how Proposition 2.5 works, right? But if you look at how much of the property tax base in these municipalities comes from coastal residences and coastal properties, it's enormous. To the extent that things start to happen where you can't get insurance, or there's a retreat strategy, or storms, and the values of these properties start to fall on the coast, the town doesn't raise any less in taxes. It just shifts that tax burden onto those who can least afford it. So to the people that are just blindly sort of opposed to any sort of increase in housing, you're going to see your property taxes increase. You're going to see your home insurance go up. It's going to become less affordable. You can hang on, but in the end, you can't fight change. It's going to come. So you can either let change happen to you, or you can plan that change.
So one thing a thread I wanted to pull on was, young people here on the Cape, and obviously, we've got an audience here at the college, but going into the high schools and going below that, I know that one of the challenges is labor here, and that a multiple of folks on the Cape are leaving the trades every year than going into it. Has the chamber looked at things that can be done, and supports and programs? And I'll want to take Seth's take on this as well, as being someone who's taught in schools. But how do we and how should the Cape families and the Cape schools be looking at and promoting opportunities in the trades in order to help buoy the labor force here?
Yeah, no, we we give a lot of thought to that at the chamber. And we're fortunate to have two really great tech schools on the Cape, and Upper Cape Tech, Cape Cod Tech. And there are waiting lists to get into those programs right now. So we are supporting that going forward for sure. But workforce, if you look at the seasonal economy, there's about 85,000 full-time jobs on the Cape. That increases by 20 to 25,000 in season. But our seasonal workforce, and whether you like it or not, I mean, see the bumper stickers that say, "We're not on your vacation." And I get the frustration of living in such a desirable place when other people are here for just a couple of months. But in 2023, Cape Cod did $2.7 billion in visitor spending. It was travel and tourism is directly responsible for over 14,000 jobs. And we generated almost $250 million in taxes, rooms and meals taxes, $160 million to the state, $80 million stays here with the 15 towns. So that's driving that. But our seasonal workforce, we already can't meet that demand. Mm-hmm. So we are heavily dependent on foreign-born labor. Students that are here from other countries on a J1 visa or an H2B visa. And just if you look at just J1 visas, we take about 5,000 of those visas every summer. There's only 100,000 available in the country, wow, which shows you how heavily dependent little old Cape Cod, the seasonal economy, is on a foreign-born workforce. So labor it is increasingly difficult to find. Skilled labor is increasingly difficult to find. And we're just going to continue to import it and see costs for people that live here increase if we don't find a way to house the people that want to live and contribute materially to our regional economy, our community, our way of life.
And so, Seth, you've been teaching in schools. What have you seen in terms of, the young people that you've been teaching? Do they have a view of future that, that they're gonna be here, on the Cape? Are you coming across young people that are looking, to get into, the trades? And I know you weren't teaching at one of the tech schools, but what are the youth of the Cape from your perspective?
So just for context, I taught during the pandemic, so the fall 2020, 2021. And then I taught, that was mainly subbing in like art, 8th grade art. And then I taught Spanish last year at Barnstable High School. So at least from like what I've seen, I would say a lot of students are just very disillusioned with college.
Mhm.
The debts, like the points. It's a different learning style nowadays, especially with social media, smartphones, and especially AI. So if I had to generalize, like, going for what do kids think nowadays? The trades are now a more attractive option than ever before.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure if it's like for the right reasons. It may be seen as an easier path, and the expectation is, oh, I can just go to trade school 4 years, become, say, a welder or a plumber, and then I'll make as much as a software engineer. Like that's kind of the logic that I hear a lot of kids say.
Yeah. And that's true in a lot of instances, I think. So
I would very much push back on that idea. They like I would some of the trades do very well? Yeah. Are they buying a house in Seattle at 26 doing very well? I don't know about that.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, there is a new and growing trend of if you were to ask kids 15 years old what they want to be when they grow up, one of the top responses is actually a streamer.
influencer, right?
Influencer, yeah. And it's not and I can completely see why someone who is 13 years old would think that. Like, why am I in school listening to teachers who make less than the people that I'm looking at on my phone right now,
Yeah.
who are 21 years old,
right.
who are streaming from their apartments, their Airbnb in Paris. And there is a somewhat belief of if I just grind on the things that I really like, in terms of that might be gaming or just creating content or whatever that niche subject is, that is a more possible path for myself than to just go through school, take on debt that is essentially a mortgage for millennials.
Mm.
And then why would I want to fall forward in that path as well?
John, what was your, path into building, and, what's your view on, young folks coming into the trades or, coming into, working, whether it's in construction management or just, being part of the solution. So kind of, again, your path and what you see.
I actually went to Northeastern for a finance degree, and I got out and I didn't want to sit at a desk. I didn't want to do emails, and I had no interest in any of that stuff. So I got a job actually framing my father's deck. And then I started working for a custom home builder, and I did that for 10 years, and I hated building these houses for these people. And so after 10 years of construction, I rolled into development, and it was, as rewarding as anything gets. You're taking a problem for a community and you're trying to fix it, and we've had success doing that. In terms of young people, the trade schools down here are excellent. I mean, my electrician, they all make over $100,000 a year. His daughter's at the trade school right now. She's a apprentice for him on my job sites, and she'll graduate and she'll be making $70,000 to $80,000 her first year. So to go to school for something like, to be a teacher or any of the lower paying jobs, you'll never be able to live on Cape Cod.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you live in Cape Cod, if you get into the trade schools, you can have a very successful life down here. You'll have a house, and you have some real skills that will get you through life. I mean, if you can't fix things at your own house, clean your own gutters, mow your own lawn, you can't live down here. It's too expensive.
Right.
The expense of living down here is astronomical. I mean, part of my problem with the state is we have the most expensive cost of housing, the most expensive cost of living, and we continue to tack on building code and energy code every single year at the same time as saying, hey, we need more housing. Let's build more housing. There's a $5 billion bill that came across, and some of it includes more energy code, which, so my $250,000 one bed, which is crazy to me, 50,000 of that is directly related to energy and building code, which is not needed. I understand we're trying to be green and effective and all that stuff, but if no one can afford to build anything, I think it's inappropriate. So,
well, I think I've heard it been said, John, that, we're already building the most efficient homes that have ever been built in the history of home building. And those incremental costs become tough, to justify on a recovery. Maybe they're being recovered, over the course of 20 or 50 or more years, but assuming those costs and tacking it onto the price tag being, what becomes the challenge, for you and for buyers.
Exactly. Harwich is at the same time, the same meetings saying, oh, we need housing, we need housing. The person behind me is saying, let's make Harwich one of the first most green communities possible. And that means instead of framing with a 2x4, which costs $4, I have to frame with a 2x8, which costs $12. And as that compounds, you run into horrible situations. We'll have $300,000-$400,000 one-bed apartments, and mine are $2,000. That's how you back into the 2% return. You'll be at $4,000 to build and rent a one bed for a bank to finance you. So we're just making it worse at the state level. Yeah, in my opinion.
So I'm getting the high sign from Christina to throw it over to her for some questions that have come in for this last portion, and we're gonna try to get folks out in a timely manner. We'll wrap it up soon, but we've got some questions we want to go to.
Yeah, and just in case you missed it, if you'd like to submit a question, you can use the QR code here. This is actually the very first question that came in, and it is, how does the Cape's housing crisis measure up to housing problems across the nation? So I'll whoever would like to talk about that, Paul,
What are your peers saying?
I mean, we're up there with in the top tier when it comes to cost of housing, production, median price. I mean, we're competitive with some in Silicon Valley and in California for a lot of this. So we're at the top when it comes to how expensive the cost of living and the cost of housing is.
How are businesses, policymakers, and residents working together on this issue, or how could they? I mean, we have a little bit of everything here, but how's that playing out in your experience?
Yeah.
I think that we have a pretty good mix of those segments of our community represented in Churro through the people who are on boards and committees. It's like the residents who are either in dire need, but mostly who have kind of an affinity for the work. Business owners by just like absolute necessity for hanging on. We have so few year-round businesses in Churro, so few businesses, period, in Churro. And I think that those, in terms of how we operate, having a diversity of opinions, a diversity of perspectives in the room. The one thing that I don't often see in housing conversations are voices representative, people who are either currently in affordable housing or who have experienced homelessness. And I think that's really to the detriment, because something that I've seen time and time again is that they'll hatch a plan, and it is absolutely a plan hatched by a community of people who have only ever experienced secure housing. It's just the way, if you've never had to worry about housing, you think about the need for it in a very different way. And so something that I would say is a really important part of this conversation is to make sure that there are stakeholders at the table who are currently experiencing the problem, have experienced the problem, who are able to provide the realities of what they need, which seems like it would be obvious. But those, as we've heard before, those are the people who are working during the day when these meetings happen, who are raising kids, who are young, who maybe don't feel confident in participating in or have had adverse experiences over and over again that make them unwilling to participate anymore. But those are the voices that I think that we really need at the table.
Well, Mar, one statistic that I want to add, because I think you touched on it, is the working homeless, right? So, we at Housing Assistance have been working for many years with the St. Joseph Shelter, on Winter Street. And I've just recently, engaged in that. During the winter, 30% of the folks that are staying at the homeless shelter are working, going to jobs, during the day, working in the coffee shops, working on landscaping crews, working, down on ferries, going out to the islands. That number jumps to 50% come summer. So, that notion, of who are, the housing insecure and who are, the unhoused, here on Cape Cod. For me, that really was, was an eye opener.
Yeah.
Christina.
What are the biggest challenges you see in accessing housing on Cape Cod? So we've talked a lot about like zoning and sort of like high level, but for say a student at Four Cs looking for housing.
Yes. A lot of choice, it's still zoning. Well, zoning will dictate where you can construct a new house or how it can be renovated. So in terms of that missing middle, duplexes, townhomes, triplexes, row houses, anything that does not look like a single family house, but definitely houses a single family, like, that kind of construction is prohibited by the current zoning. At least in Barnstable, everywhere outside of Hyannis virtually. Secondly, it's funding. I'm very curious just about what John sees, what Paul sees financially when it comes to, okay, how does a person, how does a couple, how does a family fund their home or even their rent? Does this require the invention of new financial structures? Do we need to look at our taxation policy? Can we tax land instead of property, if that makes sense? Can we create a taxation structure that aggressively goes after the second and third and fourth, fifth homes where they're used a month out of the year, and then be lax on taxation for people that live here year round so that the numbers can balance out, or if not, give us a surplus in which we can use the extra money to then fund construction or subsidize the housing for people that actually need it. Things of that kind of nature.
One of the things I just heard from what Seth's comment was just the gap that exists between supply and demand. Paul, do you have, kind of the most recent or the updated number of the unit count, that commission or others believe that we're in the hole where supply, falls below what our demand or projected need, would be?
Yeah, there are different numbers on that from different organizations, and there's a pretty wide disparity between it, but it's, it's more than 5,000, less than 20,000, depending on how far out in the future you're looking. But that's a real sort of big thing to look at. It's hard for people to swallow big numbers like that and to really understand that. So we do need to build. We do need to continue to grow. But we don't need to build more second homes. And so that becomes, and the power to control whether we're building second homes or homes for year-round residents really lies with the towns, the municipalities.
Yeah.
Something like really, really tangible to answer that question. I think that having centralized databases of future housing opportunities is a real challenge, especially on the Outer Cape. Really knowing, like, these are amazing top level answers, but I think the granular answers of really knowing what is available to apply for and having the skills, having the executive function to fill out some of these applications. Some of the applications that I filled out before I got to my current home were, literally this high of printed out paper. And I'm the type of person who is good at doing that kind of thing. But most of us aren't. And so I think that we have very real challenges just on a very base level of we're building these developments. How are we getting the word out about the developments that we're building when the information is available? How are we overcoming obstacles of people genuinely not being able to perhaps fill those applications out without support? And something that we found really successful in Truro is like a little pet project of mine that we've been working on having workshops where we have developed some materials of things that you need to collect, like get ready and stay ready, because these opportunities come up, kind of pop up, and it takes some forethought to have these documents available. But again, it's like, I think that it's one thing to build the housing. It is another thing to get people in your community into the housing. And that really needs a lot more focus and a lot more finesse.
Can I just add one thing, just as an example? Every town has housing production plans, right? So if you look at, I'll single out the town of Mashpee because I have some specific knowledge of that. But their housing production plan calls for, in the next 5 years, more than 1,500 units. But under existing zoning, the max you could build is 186. So when there's a disconnect on a town level between the housing production plan that they've endorsed and voted and the zoning, you know, that's kind of where the problem is.
Really interesting question just came in. How can our towns reclaim all this unused space? How do we turn second homes into year-round homes?
John?
I have some opinions on that one. So my list, and this comes up a lot, is you know, the second home ownership, as you mentioned, is 40% of houses on Cape Cod, off Cape, and the rest of Massachusetts around 4%. So obviously that's a major problem. That's driving up demand. Second homeowner is always going to be able to pay more for a house than somebody like us that lives on Cape Cod. So the areas that I would focus on, and Paul, maybe you'd be able to help me with this, is obviously rethink zoning. The 1 acre zoning in Harwich and these communities makes no sense anymore. I have a piece of land that's 1.5 acres. I can either build one single family house that a second homeowner will buy, or I can build 40 apartments, which will make a real dent in West Harwich. So we're going to propose the 40 units. It makes no sense to build a single family home there. Multifamily zoning, Harwich has passed it. It's allowed both of my last 2 projects. You can do either condos, which is a great form of home ownership and equity, or an apartment for somebody that wants less responsibility and is more of moving through the early stages of their lives, or later on in life, and you just want to be able to travel. Mixed-use bylaws, all these buildings are, in most Cape Cod, is either a commercial building or a single-family home, and if you combine them, you create kind of a third place that a lot of people talk about as creating community and interaction, and it's important. And then to get a little tougher on taxation, and I'm strong in the boat that the second homeowners should be paying more. We need to start driving up the costs for these people that are running businesses out of these homes that should be for us. I understand the importance of these homes to support the tax dollars. Harwich has a low tax base because of this, but if we start, you know, doubling their property taxes, or we find an appropriate middle where it no longer makes sense for people to buy every single family home, it will lower the demand on those things. And I think that's a meaningful thing that every town could do this year and start slowing down the consumption of our properties.
I want to add to that with just one example from the town of Barnstable. And it's good to sort of Seth's question earlier, like when did all this start to happen? If you look at the rapid growth in residential housing on the Cape, late 70s, 80s, early 90s, explosion, right? So a lot of towns like the town of Barnstable acted and implemented 2 acre zoning primarily at that time. And that was a blunt instrument and took over 3,000 potential units offline as a way to control residential growth and the threat that the residential growth really was presenting at the time. It was such a rapid pace. And now the town's engaged in sort of expanding its wastewater system as well in this infrastructure. But you have areas in the northern part of Barnstable Village, but especially West Barnstable, where you could have 4 acre zoning. But you have places in Centerville where maybe 1 acre, half acre zoning would allow some infill, which would also give you more ratepayers on a shorter length of pipe and make the wastewater system more expensive. So an evening out of the zoning, it wouldn't add in total theoretically any more potential housing units, but you'd get more houses built.
Paul, I think I've heard you say before, and forgive me if I'm misattributing it, but that, you know, zoning or the housing crisis is something that, you know, through things like zoning that we put ourselves into. And what that means, I believe you say, is because it's something that we created and it's a hole that we put ourselves into, it also means that it's a hole that we can get ourselves out of. Is that?
Yeah, no, and I think it is. And I think the move to 2-acre zoning in the 80s was, it wasn't the wrong move. It wasn't, they didn't do it for the wrong reasons. But, that was, 40 years ago, and things have changed. And so, but zoning is so difficult. I mean, especially in a town meeting format, because you needed 2/3 to get zoning approved. If you're talking about large capital projects or zoning projects, so difficult to convey those in a town meeting forum. But yeah, we can take a look at it and change zoning in a way that would encourage the kind of housing that we want in the areas that we want it, and still preserve the Cape as this sort of more rural and the community character that everybody has come to know and love.
So one last question that I'm going to throw out, and then we're going to go into kind of our closing. But John, as you know, seasonal communities was a designation that the Cape, and this is everyone working together on the Cape, was able to get into the Affordable Homes Act. We have now representation. Elisa Magnata, our CEO, who's here tonight, is sitting on the seasonal communities, and along with folks at the chamber and Paul and others. From a developer's perspective, and with the roadblocks and the challenges that you run into in crafting those tools, that the state will put on the table, what's on your wish list, for tools that would make the work you do in creating housing easier?
Based on what I've learned so much about the bill, each town could have $50 million of bond. Cheaper money to borrow to build these projects would be incredibly helpful. Right now, for me to borrow $1 from basically a bank or a commercial lender for a construction project, you're paying 9 to 12%. That's a scary number when you're taking a risk. So cheaper money to build these projects. The zoning, I think there's a piece of legislation for 40Y zoning, which would allow the seasonal communities to have deed restricted year-round houses.
Mhm.
So overlaying that, implementing that, getting that going. My biggest problem is I'm a 1.5-man show. My fiance Piper works with us. And we reach out to the board and to Rob and a couple other people, and nobody can tell us how to use this bill. It sounds like they passed the bill, but they haven't written the legislation. So there's no way for a small person like me to use that. The only people that can use it are the national developers, the big builders that have a whole team. And those are not the people we want on Cape Cod, because they go after 100-unit projects and they do it for dollars. They're not doing it for the community. So a way for small people, infill developers like myself, to use these resources that we're lucky that the state cares about and the chamber cares about, but get them in our hands and give us a way to use it and give us tools to get there. And we can build this.
Well, I think that does a great job of setting up kind of our closing, line of comments here. And again, the subtext on this was reasons for hope. So let's go down and just, hear, starting with Maura, your reason, for being hopeful in meeting the Cape's housing challenges.
Paul, you were just talking about the town meeting format, and I have to say I'm a sucker for a town meeting. And, we've had a couple of real contentious town meetings back to back in Truro over the last couple of years. And what I am seeing, the reasons for hope that exist for me are that things are happening. First of all, the demographics of who's showing up at town meeting is changing. And that is like so grassroots. Bring a friend, bring your snacks, make sure there's childcare, all of these different things that allow for people to be able to join in, but also empowering people that their vote matters, and that, they teaching them how to give testimony on town meeting floor. So our town meeting is coming up. We last year had such a contentious town meeting, but we did get Walsh passed, which was huge for the town of Truro. This year we're up again with the Walsh overlay district. And I think even towns like Truro that are so conservative in so many ways are voting for housing, even if it's a difficult push, pretty unanimously. And so I think there's a lot of factors that go into that, but there's movement that's possible and is happening.
Yeah, I'm hopeful. because I think we do see the changing demographics starting to take root in some of the town meeting formats. I mean, I've been to the Bourne town meeting, for example, and it is definitely skewing younger and more people with families, and that's going to change the policy outcomes. So I think the demographics are changing, but I also believe in Cape Cod. You know, we face, because we are this isolated peninsula, these shared challenges that just hit us differently than they hit the other parts of the state and the other parts of the country. So when it was a question of open space and rapid residential development, we were the first ones to come up with a land bank, and now that's been folded into sort of the CPA. When we were facing this wastewater problem, which is just huge, with only 4% of the homes on the Cape hooked up to centralized wastewater treatment, we got together. We got a plan. The towns are moving on that. So I have faith in Cape Cod, regardless of the challenge. And because change is going to happen. So we can either have change by chance or change by choice. And I think what we're starting to see now are people that want to see that change by choice.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, like I said, I'm actually very hopeful. For the first time in a long time, basically every town is talking about housing. You're getting support, and the people that resist it are being overwhelmed. And the projects take 3 to 5 to 10 years. But I think in 5 years, we're gonna have meaningful housing in most of the towns in Cape Cod. And I think in 10 years, we'll have significant housing. So I think the right things are moving forward.
Great. Thanks, Seth.
Well, Paul put that a lot more eloquently than I could ever do. I know I feel like I've been very negative the entire night, and yeah, I think of it more as like I'm Sisyphus, and I'm building this rock. I'm just going up this hill. I'm at the top, then it falls back down towards the bottom. But if you're familiar with the myth of Sisyphus, you have to imagine him happy. So I'm not hopeful. It's, if I look at all the data, all the meetings, everything that's been presented towards me, and I know that the outcome is likely to be negative, and like that's like one case, my upside still feels unlimited. Like, well, okay, so what if I do try X, Y, and Z, and let's see what can like find out what could happen if I'm alongside a panel with a developer, I can't call you a financier, can I? No, MR. Well, I don't know what is possible. I'm very, very much intrigued and invigorated to find out. So it's more so an optimism through my curiosity.
Great. Well, thank you. I'll add to that. I am optimistic because of all the panelists that we have. I'm optimistic because of the great colleagues I get to work with, like Christina and Catherine, Lisa, our CEO, and for all of you who turned out this evening and who will be watching this, on the recording, because you are supportive of the Cape finding its way out of this crisis that we're in. So I've gotten the high sign a couple times. We only had the room till 7 o'clock. I apologize if there were questions that we weren't able to get to, but encourage all of you to stay engaged with Housing to Protect Cape Cod. Go to our website, look for upcoming events. And again, thank you to all of you. Let's give a big round of applause to our panel.